Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at CSIS. The panel discussion today is to discuss two very closely related reports that we came out with recently, both of which have to do with the same subject of assessing the threats to space systems. I'm Todd Harrison. I'm the director of the Aerospace Security Project here at CSIS. And to my left, from the Secure World Foundation, and Victoria Sampson, also from the Secure World Foundation. And then down on the end, Thomas Roberts and Caitlin Johnson, who are both CSIS, part of the Aerospace Security Project. So again, thank you all for joining us. You should have received on your seats copies of the two reports. The CSIS report is the gray one, Space Threat Assessment 2018. The Secure World Foundation report, this is the white global counterspace capabilities. And, if you haven't read them all already, we will, give you a quick overview here of the contents of them. And then we're going to have a little Q&A on the page. We're going to open it up for questions from the audience. So as we're talking, if you think of a question you'd like to ask, jot it down. And before long, we'll get to Q&A and you'll have a chance to ask them. And I'll also note here, we've got the web links where you download copies of the report. So, one of the things that we wanted to accomplish in classified space threat assessment is just to raise awareness and understanding of the threats to space systems. We're really focused on threats that exist today, and what countries could be developing in the future. The CSIS, we divided the different types of threats systems into four main categories, and the Secure World Foundation has a slightly different categorization. The first category we look at is kinetic physical threats. Those are threats that physically damage or destroy a satellite by contact with it. So direct-ascent ASAT weapons that are launched do not actually go into orbit or on a suborbital trajectory, but intersect a satellite and can destroy it that way. Also co-orbital ASAT threats. So an object that is placed into orbit and then can move over to damage or destroy a satellite through physical means. Now, we distinguish from that non-kinetic physical threats. Here we're talking about something that can damage a satellite physically, but without touching it. So we're talking about like high-powered lasers, high-powered microwave weapons, threats of that sort, things that operate at the speed of light. Now, separate from that are what we call electronic threats. These are electronic attacks, and spoofing is really what we're talking about here. So interfering with the RF signal going to or from a satellite. And then the last category we have here are cyber threats. Instead of a RF signal or attacking the satellite physically, this is attacking the data that's flowing through the system. So a cyber attack could include intrusions into the control uplink to a satellite. If you can get into that command and control uplink and alter commands, you could potentially take control of the satellite, damage it, or destroy it through cyber means. So those are our four categorizations of threats. And in the report, we walk through, we focus on four main countries of interest per the National Defense Strategy. We look at Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. In a minute, we'll talk a little more about findings for each of those countries. But it was interesting in doing this analysis that Russia and China, they clearly fall in one group because they're more sophisticated, have more advanced space capabilities. But even Russia and China are different than one another. Russia, in many ways, was a great space power, declined significantly in the 90s and 2000s, but it rebuilding its space and counterspace capabilities since then. China was not a great space power in the past, but it has quickly become a more prominent space power and is rapidly developing its space and counterspace capability. Of course, Iran and North Korea are really rogue actors, rogue nations, if you will. That's how they're referred to in the strategy. And they pose a different type of threat. They don't have the same resources. They don't have the same level of technological sophistication, but nevertheless have some that can threaten U.S. space systems and those of commercial companies and allies and partners of the United States. Before I move on to Brian, I want to thank, when we did our report, the general sponsorship of the Industries Association that helped fund part of that work. So Brian, with that, I'll move it over to you.
Thanks, Todd. So I'm going to pick up where we left and talk about the highlights from our report on Russia, China, and the United States, because we also looked at the U.S. as a global space power and some of the capabilities they're working on for our Counterspace. So just to quickly move through, on the Russia side, as Todd said, we've found strong evidence that they are utilizing some of the Cold War era Counterspace capabilities, and that really kind of stretches across a spectrum of several. Russia recently, over the last years, has done orbit testing and demonstration of rendezvous and proximity operations capabilities. This is bringing one satellite close to their satellite, and that is a wide variety of applications for things like satellite servicing, but also be used in an offensive co-orbital context. It's not clear that those specific demonstrations we've seen were intended to be used capability in the future from the open source data, but certainly demonstrate capabilities that could be used that way in the near future. Russia's also been working on multiple tests of a ground-based direct-ascent ASAT capability, most notably a system known as Noodle, that they had during the Cold War, and it appears to sort of be a new version of an older capability. Unclear how specific it is for purely ASAT versus missile defense, because there's a lot of overlap between force missile defense and direct-ascent ASAT. Could potentially be both roles, but it is a potential ASAT threat to be concerned about. We did not look specifically at direct energy with Russia. Did look at direct energy, and they had a system during the Cold War that was an airborne laser dazzler. They pulled that out of mothballs, are thinking about doing flight testing again. And I think Thomas is going to talk about that in a little bit more detail once we get a little bit further in the program. The thing we saw the most evidence of is actually electronic warfare. This is something where we are seeing significant of Russia having deployed electronic warfare jamming capabilities in the field, being used in places like Ukraine in an operational context to support military activities. Whereas the other things, based on the public available evidence, is sort of in the demonstration testing sort of phase, not really in the operational use phase. This is an example of, on the right is of a Russian ZTEL jammer that had been deployed in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. This particular system, based on what's available, can jam between 100 hertz and 2,000 hertz, which includes things like cell phone radios, GPS navigation, and Iridium satellite phone signals. So you basically hook it up to a truck, hours, and it basically jamming bubble for a certain area around it. And that's really useful if you want to make sure that the adversary can't use those signals in a military theater where you're operating. The Doctrine side, there are available Counterspace capabilities. They tend to utilize it in information operations, mainly to degrade superiority adversary, an adversary that has very advanced space capabilities that are integrated into that adversary military activities on Earth. There's a couple of countries that do, but there's not quite much available publicly as. So we also, and there, as again, as Todd hinted, we see evidence of a sustained effort to develop a range of different counterspace capabilities. The difference is that these are all new for China. They're not something that's being capitalized. They're sort of being developed for the first time. And they largely fall into the same categories. So we're seeing China's on orbit, rendezvous, tests, demonstrations. Again, just like with the Russia case, it's unclear from the evidence we've seen whether they're strictly purely for ASAT use potentially in the future, or whether they're just kind of a general capabilities demonstration that could be other things as well. We've seen evidence of China one, potentially three different direct-ascent anti-satellite systems. The most publicly known test was taken in 2007 when they destroyed one of their own satellites. But similar tests that did not involve destruction of an orbital satellite occurred in 2005, 2006, 2007, 2010, 2013, 14, 16, and I think 17. So there's pretty clear evidence that this is not a one-off thing, that it's probably a program to develop something that will eventually be an operational capability. Where they are in that, very hard to tell from the public available information, but probably fairly far along that path. As an example, this is a commercial satellite photo of the Zhejiang Satellite Launch Center in Province taken in May 2013. The main space launch facilities. In the middle, you see the main launch pad they use for space launches. Well, on the top right, there's a setup that got built somewhere around 2005, 2006, which appears to have been related to testing leading up to the 2007 ASAT test. And on the bottom left, to the southeast, you see another pad that appeared around 2010, 2011, 2012, around that time frame, which appears to have been linked with an ASAT test 2013. And in fact, that red highlight box shows what looks very much like a transport erector launcher sitting on that launch pad. This is a vehicle that is commonly used to transport large ballistic missiles, basically that carries along the back and it gets to where it's going and it elevates the missile into place and then the missile can be launched. Strong evidence that this might have been what the launch vehicle was used for one of their tests. We did not look at directed energy electronic warfare for China just due to a lack of time, but and also inconsistency of publicly available sources, but there are strong indications that they're working on technologies. And in terms of a doctrine, China's public rhetoric is still very much focused on space, prevention of arms race in outer space, the need to preserve the space environment, but privately, their perspectives on this from what they write in their military writings has become a lot more nuanced. They are talking about the role of space in potential future conflicts. They're talking about, information warfare operations, sort of similar to what the Russians have been talking about. Unclear if they're thinking of space, counterspace as a way to deter aggression or something that might be used in a first strike capacity, at least in the public sense, that's unclear. As of yet, no public counterspace capabilities to support a military operation. We're seeing what Russia's doing. So finally, I'll just touch on the U.S. really quickly. Be surprised, the U.S. has been developing counterspace capabilities since the beginning of the space age with some of the early ground-based and airborne direct ascent. Russia and China, the U.S. has done multiple demonstrations on orbit and proximity capability over the last decade or decade and a half. Most of them seem to be fairly, what they actually did, but those capabilities, just like the Russian and the Chinese stuff, could be in an offensive context in some cases. The U.S. has deployed operational missile defense systems that are used in certain tweaks, and there are future plans for more mid-course missile defense systems that would have actually better ASAT capability than what are deployed. This has acknowledged counterspace they deploy. And they have a program for NavWar, which is about how to prevent the adversary use of position navigation timing in a combat setting. The U.S. probably has the most well-established doctrine and policy, at least what's publicly available for counterspace operations among the countries we looked at. As you know, about potential offensive capability, conflict on Earth that extends into space, what sort of approach the U.S. should be taking in the future. So turn it over to Victoria.
So Victoria, on the discussion particularly, because one of the countries that you guys focused on in your, and I know that you wrote this section, India, and that's not something that we really focused on in our report. So people don't think of India as a power, but What can you share about your findings?
Sure. I wanted to include India in our report, and with the idea you're just going to focus on your big concerns. But India has been a space power. They launched the first rocket in 1962. In 1980, they became the 7th country to have an indigenous launch capabilities. Historically, they've been focusing more on the economic capability space can provide. With the last 15 years, they've really changed their focus, and part of it is in response to overhead, i.e. China. We weren't the only ones who were alarmed by the 2007 ASAT test. They were as well. And then there's just, some regional, if they has space capability, they would like to have the ability to say they have that as well. It has the building blocks, but anti-capability as well. They have long-range ballistic missiles. They've said both the Agni 3 and the Agni 5 could provide some sort of intercept capability. In my opinion, I have doubts just because it's never been tested in that capacity. The missile defense system at top peak goes about 140 kilometers. There's not a lot of satellites at that level. The ICBMs do range higher, but then you run into the problem of situational awareness and seeker technology. But I think a lot of times they say this more for domestic audiences, to say, okay, we can keep up with the other guys, which is fine, but my concern is that perhaps they're going to start to believe their own hype. The Indians are still very upset about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty establishing the world into the haves and have-nots for nuclear weapon states. They believe that if they had tested a nuclear weapon prior to the NPT, they would have been brought in as a nuclear weapon state. And so my concern with India, and why I wanted to make sure we included it, is there are discussions going on within India saying, okay, maybe we just need to get some sort of ASAT test up there just to get on the record of having an ASAT program, so that if there is some sort of legal treaty or even some sort of non-legally binding measure, some sort of agreement that bans ASAT weapons or ASAT tests, we'll be on record as having had it and we'll be able to come in as a space weapon state, so to speak. So we'll see what goes, but I definitely want to include them, just again to expand the issues that we look at for space counterspace capabilities, and again to contextualize a lot of the discussion that we have, so it's more global in focus.
And Thomas, one of the areas you focused on in our report was Russia. So you want to talk a little bit about some of the things you found in your research that were interesting?
Yeah, well, of course, researching Russia in terms of counterspace capabilities is different than all the other countries mentioned so far. The other countries highlighted in the CSIS report, China, Iran, North Korea, but also those mentioned in the Secure World Foundation. Russia has a large Soviet Union-shaped shadow looming over all counterspace capabilities that we can't ignore as researchers. And so whenever you find a new system in the public domain, both reports are, of course, only using sources in their public domain, you have to ask, is this a revived activity, a continued activity from the Soviet Union, or is it something entirely new? And I have to admit, as a researcher on our own team, sometimes you're colored by what you already know about the Soviet Union when you come across new material. So when I first found the rendezvous and proximity operations that Brian was talking about for both China and Russia, my first thought for Russia was its co-orbital ASAT program from the late 1950s and early 1960s, over 50 years ago. And I didn't have that sort of starting point when I started with China because of their scratch. It's a different story. And so I want to walk you through what it felt like kind of coming across a new piece of information in my research and seeing if we can come together on and whether this is a revived activity, a new one, or a continued one. So I found this photo, both photos actually, on a Russian language forum online. That upper right photo shows a better portion of the plane. This is a Beriev A-60 jet. Not a very remarkable plane on its own, but what is remarkable is another photo on that site. And this is uploaded in 2011. The site's pretty interesting. It came down off the internet, went back up, down again, and you can find it in archived resources online. What's interesting about that image on the left is an insignia on the side of the airplane, both what it says, Sokol Echelon in Russian, and what it depicts. So the first thing I noticed is what it said, Sokol Echelon, Falcon Echelon. It's the same name as a laser-mounted airplane program started in 1965 in the Soviet Union. Other photos online show sort of a bulbous shape on the top of this airplane, suggesting there might be a laser mounted on top designed to be pointed upwards, perhaps towards a low Earth orbit satellite. But if you look at the insignia, you look at some of what's depicted, you see a falcon from the name, but you also see laser-shaped bolt, or bolt-shaped laser pointing at what looks like the Hubble Space Telescope. And this is a hard one to swallow. Of course, the Hubble Space Telescope was not around in 1965, first launched in the early 1990s. This exact insignia could not have been around the first time this program of the same name, Sokol Echelon, was around. And so you have to take that with a grain of salt. Is this a new one? This plane isn't very new. This photo is from an area of warehouses, planes going in and out of garages, of hangars. And so you don't really know what they're coming in and going out for. There's no commentary on this sort of forum. I think users can upload as many pictures as they want. They can like others, but there's no room for commentary or guessing what these planes are used for. Of course, a laser mounted on a plane, but also ground could be used to dazzle or blind a satellite with sensors or damage heat-sensitive components like solar arrays. It's hard to ignore an image like this after you see it. So after this picture made the rounds online, a few Russian reports came out in 2011 and 2012 asking, is this program in operation? One suggested yes, it was until it was closed up again, and another in 2012 due to budget cuts. Another in 2012 said that was true, but it is reopened. Other reports conflict those. These are on Russian language news sites. So it's difficult to tell. Programs that you find are new or revived ones. And that's a challenge we don't see investigating other countries across the panel here today. And I had to share that one with you. It's on page 15 of the CSIS report. You can learn more about that program and other Russian threats on our report and online. Thanks, guys.
And Caitlin, you focused in a lot of your research on the rogue states, the rogue nations. And so how are they different than what we've talked about so far here?
I mean, the rogue nations, or Iran and North Korea, we kind of coined them the rogue nations in our minds, are taking advantages where they can and places that are perhaps cheaper, less technology or technologically savvy, and they're investing pretty heavily in them. And both nations do have space programs. They're pretty tied to their ballistic missile defense programs, often used as a cover or thin veil for their ballistic missile defense program. And they're making progress in both, as kind of we all know, and that's often what the media will focus on. But what I think is really important and interesting are where they're making other advances, particularly in electronic and their cyber capabilities for both Iran and North Korea. This appears to be where they're focusing a lot of time and effort and money. Both countries have had pretty recent strides. In 2011, there were reports of Iran blinding or dazzling a U.S. satellite in orbit. They may have obtained this technology from Russia and China. It's kind of speculative, but despite the U.S. not acknowledging the incident, it's kind of commonly well known that they did accomplish this capability. We've also seen extensive jamming from Iran. In 2003, they jammed the Voice of America from their Iranian embassy in Cuba. So it's not just in their home country; they're spreading it around to other nations or other places, and they're also showing that they're willing to use it in other places. And lastly, I found really interesting was in 2011, Iran claimed to spoof or relay signals to a U.S. RQ-170 drone and down that drone or safely retrieve it inside the Iranian territory. The U.S. politely asked for that drone back. They said no. Whether or not they really spoofed it or there was some other different types of jamming going on so that they could retrieve this plane, it definitely came down in Iranian territory. And in doing some of my other later research recently on UAVs, I found that in February of this year, there was kind of a tit for tat over Syria between Iran and Israel. And the Iranian drone that Israel shot down, Israel has come out and said that it is based off of that RQ-170. So you see the greater implications of these technologies that Iran is employing. And similarly in North Korea. North Korea is, very well known for jamming along their northern territory with, or southern territory with South Korea, interfering with airports and other naval ships in the area. They have also been highly investing in their cyber capabilities, and we have seen that, locally with the Sony attack in 2014. And I read actually today, the Wall Street Journal reported that in a worldwide competition, North Korean cyber hacking teams came in first, second, and third out of about 7,000 teams. So it does seem like they're kind of putting their money into this bucket and really improving their cyber capabilities. And that can translate, from domestic attacks and financial attacks to, once they develop some more skills into attacks on satellites or ground stations. So thanks.
And we're going to come around and ask for questions in just a minute. We have microphones, so get your questions ready. Before we do that, I should just note that it's not entirely a coincidence that we have these two reports that came out at about the same time on the very similar topic, and that we're doing this event here together. The backstory here is each organization had started working on these space threat assessment reports on our own. And then in conversations, we realized we were doing basically the same thing. And so we decided then towards the end to collaborate, to kind of join forces in rolling out our reports together. And we do hope to make this an annual recurring product, to update it every year with new information that's come out and expand the analysis further and further every year. So with that, I want to open it up. Questions from the audience. I think we have microphones here in the back. All right, we'll come right up front here. Yeah.
Can you just stand up and introduce yourselves?
Sorry. Yeah, in front of him.
Yeah, there you go.
Hi, I'm Teresa Hitchens with the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland. And thanks for the presentation. Thanks for the studies. I've actually read them both. And they're well done. I wanted to ask the question about what you didn't find. And I think the interesting question here is the one about Doctrine, where we have some questions about what exactly intentions are with regard to these developments and also about usage. You mentioned that the Russians have used things, and I'd kind of just like to know about usage by other countries as well.
So from the research we did for our report, we saw I think a clear distinction in capabilities. So the things we saw being used, particularly in operational context, were the electronic warfare and the cyber attacks. And it seems that, for better or for worse, has come out as sort of the okay thing that you use in a counter-based capability in the real world. And we worked with CSIS on a tabletop exercise a year and a half ago to look at some scenarios, and there we found the teams were very willing to go ahead and use cyber capabilities, electronic warfare capabilities, and much less so, kinetic capabilities against satellites. And we're seeing a little bit of that, I think, in the real world. On the kinetic side, at least from my perspective, we're seeing a fair amount of testing and some technological development. But we haven't uncovered any examples of the kinetic capabilities being used in an aggressive manner in an operational context in a conflict. And so the question is that why, right? Is that because they're not ready? Is that because there's no conflict between great powers that have satellite capabilities? Is that because of the nuclear deterrence link? That's a little murkier, but we really haven't seen that yet. And then the other big question is that going to persist in the future? Or are there going to be conditions that mean that those might actually get used?
I would just echo some points there that there really is not a lot out there in open source in terms of Doctrine. And, we like to think that we can understand someone else's intent. Quite honestly, I don't know that we can each understand our own intent. People do things for a lot of different reasons. They may not even realize why they're doing it. And it certainly applies to nation states where it's not just one actor, it's many, many actors that are all, working together or sometimes at odds. I don't think we're really going to know how other countries intend to use Counterspace capabilities in a conflict until it starts to happen. Unfortunately. Now, what we are seeing, the evidence, the open source information clearly shows that electronic attacks, jamming and spoofing, and cyber attacks, it appears that countries tend to view this as being below threshold, that you can do this without causing escalation. You can get away with it. And that's a dangerous precedent to set. And I find it striking that a lot of times when we talk about conflict in space in the United States, people immediately gravitate towards like Star Wars and like physical destruction of things, right? And like human combatants in space and space marines, which of course is not the case at all. This is one domain where it is, for military purposes, there's no reason to have humans there. So you're not going to have human combatants in space for the foreseeable future. It's, some unfortunate non-combatants on the International Space Station might get caught up in this, but it's all a remotely operated domain, and all this focus on the kinetic type physical attacks in space, I think, detracts from the real threat we're seeing today. Are these electronic and cyber threats, and that's where we really ought to be focusing our attention, because you can imagine a scenario where if someone ramps up the jamming to a point, even though jamming is reversible, you can ramp up jamming and jam certain U.S. space systems that the U.S. at some point is going to find that to be escalatory. And the person doing the attack may not realize that they're crossing a threshold if we haven't clearly communicated what that threshold is, and not cross it, and to be credible when we communicate it with credible responses. If someone jams nuclear command and control systems, is it really credible that we're going to go to nuclear war over jamming those systems? I don't know that it necessarily is. What is a better, more credible response to something like that? And we got to communicate that. And if we have systems, to protect our systems or to detect these kind of things or geolocate or better attribute, especially things like cyber attacks, it's not going to help deter those attacks if no one knows those capabilities exist. So part of it is we got to be willing to show what we can do in some cases. And that's where it's pushing against a cultural bias towards secrecy.
If I could, one more thing to add into that, Teresa. I mean, we did want to include Doctrine. Sometimes, we have some countries are less transparent about their thinking than others. But part of the reason why Secure World was very interested in doing this report is we wanted to put out, here's what we know, and even more importantly, here's what we don't know. And so a lot of times in our report, we say, here's this capability. It could be X, it could be Y, we don't know. I think a lot of times when people focus on these issues, they tend to say, okay, they've got this capability. Clearly, it's intended against the United States in an aggressive manner. Maybe, maybe not. We're not the only country in the world. So that was one of the things we tried to do. But also, making this challenging is that a lot of countries that just have different setups. They don't have inter processes for these sort of things. India does not even have a national space plan. They've got kind of a loose series of regulations. Who knows how the North Koreans do things? They're probably top down. So, I mean, it's really difficult to get a good concept of what their plans are. As Todd said, intent is very difficult to look at.
Just two more quick points. One, if you're the warfighter, those reversible jamming capabilities could be just as detrimental to your mission as a kinetic destruction of a satellite. And if you talk to, the U.S. military, who are off trying to figure out how to deal with this, they will more often focus on the threat posed by the jamming, electronic warfare, and cyber capabilities than they will the kinetic capabilities. Yes, kinetic could theoretically happen, but they're seeing the electronic warfare stuff happen today, and so that's sort of the very pressing threat if you're the warfighter trying to figure out how to handle all this.
Thank you, Edward F., Georgetown University. One idea that's been around for a long time for dealing with at least some of these threats is a code of conduct for spacefaring nations. The Europeans worked hard on this for a long time. They seem to have given up, at least partly because of lack of U.S. interest. Do you have an update on this, and do you think we should be showing more interest in that concept?
It wasn't just the United States. Actually, the United States supported it, and I think probably Frank Rose can speak to that. He worked pretty closely on that. It was two things. One, the rest of the world felt that they've been left out of the process. And so they thought it was, the European colonizers coming in again to create a circumstance that's going to be against them, which is ridiculous because it was such a vanilla document. It was fine. There was nothing wrong with it. It was stuff that probably most countries that operate in space do anyways. But it was just they screwed up from a diplomatic standpoint. As far as we know, nothing's happened since the summer, July 2015, when they had discussions in New York. My EU colleagues perhaps can correct me on this, but I keep hearing that it's not dead yet. It's just waiting, and they have plans. I hope they do. I think, but for me, the real benefit for the code of conduct, even if it didn't turn into a final product, it showed the importance of non-legally binding resolutions to these sort of issues, and it showed that the idea of discussing where the fault lines are is a TCBM in and of itself. And so I thought that was really helpful that we had the conversation, even if it didn't end up in a final document.
I would add one thing there is that the process involved in getting some sort of a code of conduct international agreement is going to be incredibly difficult. I wouldn't hold my breath that it's going to happen anytime soon because there's so many different competing interests. What you hear the U.S. military talking about more and more is just norms of behavior. And norms can be established without necessarily formal agreements. They often get established by practice. And if you want to establish norms, you have to start practicing them, right? And then communicating that to people that I'm acting this way in this situation, this is why, and I expect other people to act the same way. So leading by example is one way of starting to establish norms of behavior. But in a lot of areas, like, in space, when it comes to remote proximity operations and things, we're going into some uncharted territory. There are a lot of commercial companies that are talking about doing things like on-orbit servicing, and I know, Brian, you're working on some of this in your research now, that, hey, we're going to have to figure this out as we go, and maybe more for commercial reasons in the beginning than necessarily for military reasons.
Mm-hmm. So just to add on what Victoria said, yes, the process was not handled very well in creating the code of conduct. But if you look what happened towards the very end in that last meeting, the Russians, with a little bit of help from the Chinese, were able to convince much of the rest of the world this was a Western product that was kind of being foisted upon them. What I think is more interesting is the Russians tried that same strategy in the UN Committee on Pieces of Outer Space with another effort, the long-term sustainability best practices effort. And it didn't work. In that particular forum, the Chinese, the Brazilians, and everyone else broke with what the Russians were trying to push things and said, no, we think this is a useful activity. And that, I think, is an important distinguishing feature between what happened with the Code of Conduct and the so far successful long-term sustainability effort in UN COPUOS. Now, one of the big differences is the COPUOS effort does not look at security issues. It's meant to deal with space sustainability best practices in general. But I do think if we can, as Todd sort of hinted at, if you can look at some of the maybe non-security things and set some best practices and norms, that then may then lead to an easier discussion on the military side in the future.
Hi, thanks for the presentation and the good work. I'm Bruce MacDonald with Johns Hopkins SICE and the Federation of American Scientists. In the last few years, the United States has expressed, at long last, a lot more interest about there's always been some interest, of course, but more specific policies addressing the question of resilience, the ability to sustain damage or attacks and still have the space architecture deliver what is needed. And one of that, for example, is disaggregation rather than having a few blunderbuss satellites to try to disaggregate that. My question may be a little too esoteric there, but the question is, are there any open source signs that any of our potential adversaries are beginning to react to this, where a multiplicity of targets, we may be in a perpetual game like we were in the old days for anti-submarine warfare. Do you see any signs of that?
I don't see signs of that, but I think that's because we haven't actually started to change and be more resilient. Maybe, there are signs now that we're actually getting serious about the next generation of constellations, maybe designed to actually be more resilient, but that's going to be 10 years out before these systems are realistically going to be fielded. You hear General Hyten talk about it, that we don't need to buy any more big, fat, juicy targets. And specifically talking about, missile warning satellites, overhead persistent infrared. Let's see it, right? Let's see a new design of a constellation that is a small number of large, highly aggregated, expensive satellites that are big, fat, juicy targets. So once we change our architectures, then we may see other countries react. But the whole point of fielding more resilient architectures is that you do it in a way that is difficult for them to respond to, that there's no easy solution for them. You complicate the targeting problem. So that would be the intent. And the reaction may be that they double down their efforts in other domains, which is a success for space.
So the new buzzword is defendable, not resilient. But if you peel back the layers, it incorporates resilience and all that sort of stuff. I would say we didn't see strong evidence of the reaction. I will relay one anecdote. I was working a couple years ago on a project to look at U.S.-China relations and strategic domains, the one that I think you were involved in as well. And I had a discussion with, I was working with a Chinese co-author on basically the space domain. And I basically briefed him on what the U.S. was doing on resilience and improving stuff and making it so if you try and attack the systems, they degrade gracefully. And he was like, well, you can't do that. I mean, what are we going to do then, right? It was so, and this was not a PLA person. It was, basically a researcher in China. So I have no idea what the official reaction would be. But if you think about it that way, I mean, if you think about it as they, at least in this case, the Chinese, see their offensive-based capabilities as a way to deter U.S. aggression in their sphere of influence. If you take away that ability to deter us, I think they would see that as a very threatening or a very problematic situation. Now, whether or not you actually believe that is the main purpose of their ASAT weapons, another discussion, I think, is, as we hinted earlier. But either way, I think if we actually were able to make U.S. systems resilient, defendable, whatever it is, I think that would create a pretty significant challenge that they would probably be very worried about.
Thanks to all of you for the reports, which I thought were excellent. Jamie Moran with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at Aerospace Corporation. Brian, you just started into where I wanted to go with my question, which is, as you're gearing up for your next round of this report, your next annual version, which we'll hold you to, I'm curious what developments each of you would see on the potential U.S. adversary side would be the most threatening or challenging, that if you documented them in your next report, you'd be concerned from a U.S. perspective, and vice versa. And if you want to start playing other, many versus many analysis here as well, but sure, but that adds a lot of complication.
So I'll say, for me, it would probably be additional rendezvous and prox ops demonstrations that look a lot more like a co-orbit ASAT test. So what I mean that is what's happening so far, if you look at the actual orbital dynamics of it, it's sort of like that scene from Austin Powers where the roller is coming at the guy and it takes like 5 minutes for him to get to it. It's very much like that. And you have a satellite and something rendezvousing with it, but that rendezvous is taking place over days, if not longer. very slow speed sort of a thing. Not what you would really think about in terms of the dynamics of a co-orbital ASAT that is being used in an offensive capability. So if there was something that looked a lot more like kind of the classic Cold War era ASAT intercepts, particularly at the geostationary orbit, I think that would be extremely worrying from my perspective. That's my big thing.
I would expand on what Brian said, because I'm also concerned about Russian co-orbital ASATs. But instead of how they administer the attack or how it could happen, instead you're seeing some of these analyses from the Secure World Foundation, these rendezvous proximity operations, satellites that were launched a few years ago engaging in some of these maneuvers. So as I would be more concerned as the age of these satellites gets older, which we've seen sometimes, if in the next version of this report next year or the year that came after, that some of these satellites we're seeing moving have been there for much longer.
Oh, Caitlin?
For me, I also worked on our non-state actor section, and what would be really concerning to me is to see this proliferate. I mean, I was kind of surprised at how much I was able to find, and a little concerned with the fact that, it's just probably going to grow. Jamming technology is getting smaller, it's easier, it's cheaper. You can buy it from Radio Shack. And seeing non-state actors using this technology in the field against our warfighters would be pretty concerning to me.
And one of the things that would concern me is seeing evidence of on-orbit electronic attack, so jamming spoofing from orbit. So then you could potentially disrupt satellite links, things like that. And also the non-kinetic physical forms of attack, like lasing and high-power microwaves from on-orbit sources. So if you can miniaturize the technology, put it on another satellite, if you're going to do actual destructive, structural or, trying to damage the circuits on a satellite using something like a laser or a high-power microwave, it's a lot better to do it outside the atmosphere, space to space. And so if you see, other countries, Russia and China in particular, developing and demonstrating that technology, I think that would be very troublesome.
For me, I think the thing that'd be really concerning is anything that creates large amount of debris on orbit, particularly when we're starting to see mega constellations being launched last time I heard it was 20,000 in the next 10 years. So that's going to be a real challenge from a space traffic management viewpoint, but I think it's also going to be a huge security challenge as well. So that would be my concern.
I'm Ariel Borowitz with Georgia Tech. So really interesting presentations. I guess the question I had, I know all of you follow these issues on kind of a day-to-day basis. And so I'm curious, when you did the kind of in-depth research to actually write up the reports, was there anything that you came across that you found surprising that you didn't really see in the day-to-day?
There were a lot of surprises, I think. But and for me, it was the non-state actors. And, even like jihadist groups in Pakistan, there are reports out there of them testing GPS jammers. Like, okay, yeah, it's localized, but we rely on a lot of GPS-guided munitions to try to hit these folks. And the fact that they're getting sophisticated enough and they're getting access to the technology that they could make our precision-guided weapons less precise, that's interesting and disturbing.
So I would say I was a bit surprised in a couple of cases just how much data is available if you go looking for it. Going around in some of the Chinese sites, and there's tons of photos of test launches, people like outside the fences on certain facilities taking photos of launch pads. When they do, their direct-ascent suborbital testing, sometimes the lighting is such that you see it at night, and there's all the Chinese social media is full of people taking photos of really amazing UFOs and, glowing clouds at night. And that's all from a lot of the ballistic missile testing. There was a Dutch airline pilot who caught some really great photos of one of these tests over the desert as they were flying a route. They just had a perfect lighting conditions to go photograph some of it. So for me, and Thomas's what he found with the social echelon, right? There's another case we found a photo of a system that the U.S. government won't talk about publicly, and it was in the company's calendar. It was like an artwork of what the system looked like, right? So just the availability of this stuff, if you looking and you kind of know where to look about how much is possibly out there in the open source world, that I found kind of surprising.
For me, I do follow this sort of thing on a day-to-day basis, and this reminds me of Teresa's question about which of these capabilities are actually being used today. We highlighted electronic warfare coming from Russia, and you do hear on a day-to-day basis some GPS spoofing in the Black Sea. A fisherman can't find his way, he gets too close to a Russian port. We recognize that story, but the magnitude of some of these stories is what I missed over the years. So in the Crimean conflict in 2014, you hear reports from Ukrainian officials of thousands of GPS jamming incidents. One report claimed over 7,000 jamming incidents. And that's way more than I was on my radar, and I think I noticed reading these stories on a day-to-day basis.
I also helped out on the China section, and not a China expert at all. This was kind of my first foray into that kind of space. I was surprised at how much was out there. The doctrine was hard. I obviously don't speak Chinese, so translating was a little wishy-washy. Had to rely on some friends, but they pretty much acknowledged that they consider space a warfighting domain, and that was really surprising to me, to find that publicly and to see them acknowledge that openly when they've kind of been pushing that space should be safe and for the use of science and for everybody.
And for me, it was perhaps an embarrassment. It was new for me. But as a person who focuses on space security, we tend to look outward and not at the United States. So when I was editing the U.S. section, I was actually surprised by a lot that I found in there. NavWar, I always thought meant like something else. And so I had to look up the acronym, like, no, that can't be right. Oh, I guess it is. Oh my gosh, we do all that stuff too. So for me, that was really interesting as well.
And overall, I thought it was interesting that a lot of these countries that we're researching, they don't really try to hide the existence of a lot of these capabilities and a lot of these systems. Now, the technical details, sure. But a lot of this, if you just go look, it's right there. They're not even trying to hide it. They put up photos or they allow photos to get out. So, that was pretty surprising.
Or they do pressers, or they put out company press releases and stuff.
In some cases, they definitely brag about things that are probably beyond their actual capability. So you have to sort through some of that and take it with a grain of salt. But their countries are out there, and they are clearly trying to communicate that this is a contested domain. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi, Therese Jones, Satellite Industry Association. You touched a lot on electronic warfare quite a bit with spoofing and jamming in a military context, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you think the biggest economic threats are with electronic warfare, particularly with the vulnerability of civil GPS to spoofing and what that could mean for, say, the financial industry.
So I'll just say, all the examples that we found, at least the ones that I can recall, that we talked about of spoofing and jamming, were all of commercial civil signals. Because if there was a successful jamming of a military signal, we probably wouldn't know about it, right? So not to say that it's not happening, but the ones that get reported tend to be the jamming of a commercial communication satellite or of the civil GPS signal. So yes, there probably is a lot of potential implications there. And for us, that was one of the reasons that we had for writing this report from the Secure World side, was because there seems to be two different discussions going on, right? There's the discussion going on of the commercial space world about how everything's great and all these great innovations and all this great money flowing into there and all these amazing things in the future. And then there's this national security discussion about war is going to come to space and it's going to be this future conflict and great power conflicts back again. And the linkage between those two seems to be really important, right? What does this future conflict in space, great power competition mean for the economic commercial development of space and vice versa? And we didn't see a lot of overlap of those two communities, those two discussions. So that was one of the things that we wanted to try and highlight, because I don't think we understand what the implications are for the commercial industry of the proliferation of counterspace capabilities and the potential for conflict to extend into space. And the military has, I think, thought a little bit about how they might use commercial to deal with some of the vulnerabilities. But as we talked about, there's still a long ways to go to figure that out.
Yeah, and it does raise an interesting question, too, of how do some of these commercial companies, if they do at all, how do they price in, if you will, this risk to their business models. And so, if there is some sort of a conflict, if jamming, all of a sudden really picks up in a conflict situation, how are they going to handle that? And in particular, if the U.S. government is leasing, or U.S. allies are leasing transponder space for a commercial satellite, and we're in a conflict, that's going to be fair game for someone to try to jam that, and they may be knocking a lot of commercial users off that satellite. What is the company going to do? How are they going to recover their losses? Are they going to try to stop doing business with the U.S. government to try to make themselves not a target? Are they going to think about this in advance and say, you know what, maybe I don't want that customer, U.S. government, because I don't want to be a target? And then from a policy perspective, do we need to think about offering indemnification for companies, satellite operators that do business with the government to protect them from some of these losses? So there are a lot of implications once you go down this road. And in some of the jamming that we did find, it was non-state actor jamming. It was jamming in one case in Iraq, and early in the Iraq War. It was jamming of a commercial satellite signal that transponder that was being used by the military at the time. So they were jamming a military signal, but it was over a commercial satellite.
Also, just real quick, I presented the findings of this report, Secure World's report, last month in Geneva at the Conference of Disarmament. And as you can imagine, some of the countries there were very interested in what we had to say. And some of those countries were very dubious about the need to bring in commercial sector at all when you're talking about national security. They said, no, there's no relation. And there's no need to bring it in. And so in my mind, it's really difficult to come to a common understanding about these threats when you don't even agree on what the basic threat is, or what the biggest security concerns are, or much less what venue you want to use to address those threats.
Thanks. Pete Hayes, Space Policy Institute at George Washington. So you might have addressed this when I was being delayed by my friends at Metro, but my question has to do with the whole declassification issue. And as you know, we've had repeated calls, maybe for about a decade now, from very senior level officials saying that the United States ought to declassify, or at least lower the classification levels about what we know in space. And so my question for you is, I suspect you would all agree with that, but I'm wondering if you have any concerns about how that might happen with respect to either the United States revealing too much, or things that might have some specific kind of blowback effect about revealing our own capabilities, or the counterpart capabilities on the part of our potential adversaries. And then finally, if you have some specific recommendations for how to make that happen, because it has been a long time in coming, and don't see a lot of progress yet.
Yeah, so I've mentioned this in writings before and in congressional testimony. I think we overclassify quite a bit. Surely there are certainly things that need to remain secret, especially if revealing the existence of something would negate its value. You certainly want to try to keep that secret. But when we're looking at what we're keeping secret and what we may want to disclose, two factors I would consider. One, is it really secret? Are we actually hiding it from anyone? Like, we don't publish, in the Space Catalog and spacetrack.org, we don't publish, the positions and the orbital tracks of lots of satellites that are easily trackable, that everyone knows. They have ITU filings for their orbital slot, and we try to keep that secret somehow. Are we really hiding it from anyone, especially when you've got a lot of commercial companies that are doing SSA commercially, not using government resources? They can find these things, and they're selling that data to companies, but other countries can get that too. So is it really secret? If it's not really secret, why are you trying to hide it? And number two, will it enhance deterrence? Because I've never heard of a country that's been deterred by something they didn't know existed. And so if it is something that the mere communication of that we have a capability like this, not the technical details necessarily, but that we have something like this, if that could deter bad actors, that's a good thing to declassify. And we have done this. At least one good example of that, General Hyten declassified the GSAT program, these small satellites that go around and look in the geostationary belt. that had been a classified program. They came out, I think it was 2014, and declassified it. I think that's great, because now countries that are thinking of possibly doing something, they shouldn't be doing around the GeoBelt, they at least know we can see them. We're watching. Okay, they're not hiding from us. And so I think we need to do more things like that over time. Clearly not the things that are going to negate the capability, but things that will enhance deterrence and things that are not really a secret anyway.
So clarification on the GSAP, they didn't declassify, they acknowledged the existence of the program, but if you go to the spacecraft website, they don't acknowledge where they are, and they don't talk about what they're doing. Now you can find that in some other places that you kind of hinted at. I would say, for me, it's part of this discussion of the normalization of the space domain. I think that the declassification discussion needs to be part of that, and that if we're going to start, there's been a lot of talk the last couple of years in the U.S. about spaces normalizing and how it's becoming like the air, land, and sea domains from a warfighting context. And I think that part of that discussion has to be, well, we need to become more like them in a security classification context. We acknowledge we have aircraft carriers. We don't talk about their top speed. We don't talk about how fast they can turn. And we take care to have certain OPSEC over the really sensitive parts of their missions to protect the things we really need to protect. But if they happen to pull into port and somebody can take photos of it, well, that has some value, that it pulls into port and people can take photos of it, from what you were talking about, the deterrence aspect of it. And if we have a capability that the mere acknowledgement negates that capability, I kind of wonder why we invested so much money in that capability in the first place.
We better invest a lot in keeping it secret.
Well, right. So, but there are no easy answers here, as you well know. A lot of this is cultural, and just the way that organizations have grown up in the U.S. to do this missions over decades, and the sort of culture they have adopted for it. It's very, very difficult to change that.
My name is Roger Cochetti. I'm an author of a series of history books on the satellite industry for Wiley Publishers. And my question really kind of plays a little bit off of the last one. It has to do with the strategy and the development of technology for countermeasures and defensive measures. Many of these technologies have been around for decades, since Star Wars, or even earlier. Jamming goes back to World War II. So it's, that technologically, few of these are sort of, I never thought of that. Maybe CubeSat swarming is only the last 10 years, but other than that, most of these things are. So the issue that I was hoping you guys could address was from a strategy perspective, how useful is it to keep countermeasures secret? Or how useful would it be to say that, hey, you may have submarines, but we have depth charges, so don't inflate your ability. And in addition to that, this is all highly classified, obviously, but if anybody has anything to say about new technology developments for all of these new offensive technologies that you could talk about, that would be helpful too. Thanks.
Let's just say, for me, that counterspace, or the defensive counterspace piece, again, for me, that's part of the normalization, right? I'll make an analogy to the aircraft world, where we equip aircraft with flares and chaff and electronic countermeasures pods to do exactly what you're talking about. So if somebody fires a surface-to-air missile, if it's a radar, we can pop some chaff. If it's an infrared seeker, we drop flares, and otherwise we could do some ECM with it. You certainly could talk about that for satellites, right? And to expand the air metaphor, there's a range of things we can do, right? One of those is if somebody shoots at us, we actually have sort of the close countermeasures. But there's also the more kind of preemptive stuff, where the Air Force used to have something called the Wild Weasels, which were F-16s designed to go find and kill SAMs before they were launched. And that's another approach to it. In the land world, tanks nowadays have reactive armor in them, where penetrating missiles coming in and they can react out and destroy it before it destroys the armor. Those are all sorts of things that we should probably start thinking about when building satellites. Now, of course, the details of that are probably pretty classified. even if the satellite itself is classified, that's probably classified as well. But that's part of the conversation I think we need to have. I would just say one more thing from our perspective. Another reason we did this report was there's not a lot of public discussion on this issue, right? We have fairly public discussions about strategies and what to do with Iraq and what to do with North Korea. Not a whole strategy, obviously, but large parts of it. And getting back to the commercial thing, this counterspace proliferation has a huge potential to impact our daily lives if it disrupts the space capabilities we use every day, weather satellites, imagery, GPS. So I would think the public then should have at least some awareness of what the U.S. government is planning to do and to judge whether that makes sense, whether it might have repercussions that they might have thought of. That I would hope we would have a little more open discussion about. And we thought the first step in doing that was to talk more openly about the counterspace capabilities.
I think you raise a great point, and that is kind of the next step in this discussion, is talking about how do you protect against some of these threats. And again, let's be careful not to just gravitate towards kinetic. But we talk about like electronic threats and spoofing. It's electrical engineering. It's not secret. Folks study this in school. There are a lot of things you can do to make a signal more difficult to jam. Frequency hopping, spread spectrum, interleaving, nulling antennas. Onboard processing signal and error correction in the satellite. These things are known. What we should be talking about is how can we do more of this? How can we make more of our satellites more resistant to more types of attack? And what are the types of attack we ought to be most worried about? I asked a question in a forum with a bunch of Air Force space leaders 6 months ago. I asked a simple question of, what threats are you most concerned about? Their answer was all of them. Okay, well, that's a good priority list there. And that's not an acceptable answer. I would show them that quad chart. I want them to say, tell me what are your highest priorities? Because you can't do all of it. You don't have the resources, you don't have the time. So let's talk about which ones can you try to mitigate, which ones are most important, which would have the most consequence, which are most likely to occur. Let's have that discussion and prioritization, and let's start seeing that work its way into the budget and into the program of record, and actually see systems get fielded that have this higher level of protection. Because if you want to avoid conflict in space, the best way to do it is make it not worth anyone's time. And so I think that ought to be the motivation here, is to deter it from ever happening. So any other comments before? All right, I don't want to keep people from the reception that we have outside. So thank you all for joining us, and please join us at the reception.